Crafting a unique Mandalorian identity is more than just making a suit. It's about channeling history, imagination, and personal flair into every piece. To best illustrate this to you, we will go over how I created my own Mandalorian original character. I'll walk you through the steps and inspirations that shaped the final design from the first spark of an idea to the refined concept. So, the very first thing you have to settle is the actual look of your armor, or sort of the aesthetic that you're going for. The main thing to decide here is if you want your armor to actually look like it could be part of the Star Wars universe. Because if you do, then you have to decide what time period you want your Mando to live in and then do some research about the Mandalorians from that specific time period. This is also where I started. I knew I wanted to make a Clone Wars era Mandalorian, so then of course looking at the references from the Clone Wars show and specifically then the female armor and what that would look like. At this point in the process, I definitely would recommend looking up some pictures for inspiration, whether that be other Mando cosplayers or then actual characters or background characters in different Star Wars media. And really what you want to nail down here is the actual style of the armor you're going for. And there is plenty to choose from. Things to consider are what armor pieces you're going to have. Are you going to have a jetpack? What kind of weapons are you wielding? And what about a cape or a poncho? It's important to also not forget about the soft items, so the flight suit and vest, what you want those to look like, and then belts and possible belt items, holsters, all that kind of stuff. At this point, I would suggest you just let your imagination run wild. Don't really think about how you're going to connect these things or attach them or anything like that. That comes later. And once you have all that figured out, the next step is the colors and the markings. And with this, it really comes down to personal preference, unless you're going for something specific like a night owl or Mandalorian. It's good to do actual sketches or try out your ideas on one of the Mando Maker websites. For my design, I wanted to go with black and white, since my idea from the beginning was to make something inspired by skulls and bones. And the reason why I decided to base it off that is kind of like a Batman and bats kind of thing. Because when I was small, I was really scared of like skeletons and especially like skulls. So then now sort of wearing it as my Mando armor is kind of like poetic. I don't know. Anyway, no, but you really don't have to have any deeper meaning for your design, and just go with whatever you think looks good. That's the most important part. But if you are going to base your design on something concrete like a skull, it can be quite difficult to make that fit into the aesthetic of the Star Wars universe. So to make sure it was realistic in terms of Star Wars, I looked up some references from already existing designs that incorporated similar elements that I was thinking of. Using references just makes it so much easier to match your new creation to the already existing aesthetic of the Star Wars universe. And once you have the overall colors and markings, if you have any, it's time for what is, at least in my opinion, the most fun part, which is all these small details. Here again, you can just add stuff you think is cool, like there is no rules when it comes to stuff like this. But for me, I wanted to include stuff that was important to me somehow, and then also provide an explanation in universe for everything. Because when you're creating your Mando, it's not just armor, it's also a character. And at least for me, the backstory of my character was a pretty natural product of the design choices that I made. So I didn't really feel like I was creating a character, rather discovering one, if that makes sense. Let me illustrate that for you a little bit better. For example, my favorite Star Wars character is Fives, so I wanted to reference him by adding a 5 on one of my gauntlets. And the in-universe explanation for that is that Arla, which is the name of my Mando OC, painted that 5 on her gauntlet as an homage to her family. Her family used to call themselves the Clan of 5, since there were 5 of them. Or then the text that I included on the helmet is there because I wanted to include my favorite Star Wars quote, which is "Live to fight another day." And of course I could have just written it there like in normal letters or even in Oramesh, but I wanted it to fit a bit better into the backstory I had already started to form for my character. So it would make sense to write it in actual Mandoa. And since I don't know Mandoa very well, I went to Reddit, where I was advised that the best translation for Live to Fight Another Day is Ke Kuyani Akanir Tugik, which directly translates to survive to fight again. And again, for this little detail there's a whole backstory, but I'm going to go into all of that in another video. But the main point is that I didn't really think of a backstory for any of these details when I decided to include them, but I waited until I had the whole design finished and I had established a kind of frame for the backstory based on the time period that I chose. And then from there, fill in the blanks using the details included in the armor. Another thing I think is really important to mention is that whenever you embark on a journey to create any character, be open and ready for major changes as well. For me, I had decided on my final concept a long time ago, but then did some major changes the day before I started painting. I felt like my design would be a bit out of place in an actual Star Wars setting, so I wanted to ground it a bit more into the story of the character. So I decided to incorporate a blue color, not just because I like blue, but also because it is sort of the color often used in traditional Kalevala attire and art, and I had decided already that my character's home planet would be Kalevala. Then I also made some other important design choices related to this, mainly that I decided to paint everything blue first, even the gauntlets and the shoulders that would eventually be all black. And the reason for that is so that I could add a chipping effect to show some of the blue under the black layer. In that way I could show some of the story of the armor in the actual paint job, so that it all used to be blue once and the black was added later. And honestly, at least for me, I think the magic and what really ties the design together and makes it realistic is all the small details and having a story, or at least an idea, behind every little mark that you make. And the same goes for weathering. My armor is not that weathered, but if you are going for a more weathered look, I think it's a great idea to plan that all out beforehand, since all the scratches and marks have a story to tell. And again, the same principle could work in that process. You don't have to have the backstory to come up with what it would look. You can also just decide to go with something you think looks cool and let that then tell the story and help you to come up with the backstory for the character. But that's also just one way of doing it. If you find it easier, you can also first come up with the backstory and then think of like, okay, if this happened, then how would that affect how my armor looks? So really, there is no right or wrong when it comes to armor design, or just be mindful of if you want it to look like you actually stepped right out of a Star Wars movie, then there are certain aesthetics and aspects that's just gonna help you with achieving that. But then if you really just want something that you love and you don't really care if it looks realistic in terms of Star Wars or not, then really go wild. The sky is the limit. But yes, that is the process that I went through when designing my Mando, and if you want to see how I brought that design to life, then check out this video right here. I promise you won't be disappointed.